You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 10th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme, at least 8 killed in a school shooting in Graz. We'll have the latest. Also ahead.
It's lucky for the people in Los Angeles and in California that we did what we did. We got it just in time. It's still simmering a little bit, but not very much.
Is US President Donald Trump trying to stop a riot or start one? Later in the show, as pressure tightens on Iran over a nuclear deal, Iran claims to have something on Israel. We'll wonder why the response to Italy's citizenship referendum was a countrywide shrug.
Yes, low voter turnout continues to plague Italy, but we'll unpack why this time it's what the government wanted.
And we'll find out how China is leveraging its rare earths wealth. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. We start with breaking news from Austria. Police in Graz have confirmed that at least 10 people are dead in a shooting at a secondary school. Graz's mayor, Alexei Korolyov, has confirmed that the gunman is among the dead and that there is no further danger. Well, I'm joined with the latest by Alexei Korolyov, Monocle's Vienna correspondent. Alexei, what do we know for sure? This is, of course, only emerging in the last hour or two.
Yes, indeed. So, as you said there, Andrew, Alexei Korolyov, the mayor of Graz, has been talking to journalists in the city, and she just confirmed that 10 people were dead in the attack, and the perpetrator was among the dead as well. It's not clear at the moment whether the suspected gunman was a student or a former student at the school, or indeed what their motive was. And both the authorities and public figures in Austria are urging against speculation on this count. So what we do know is that the attack happened around 10 a.m. this morning in a big secondary school in Graz, a bit out of the city centre in an area close to the main railway station there. And the area is still cordoned off. But indeed, as you said there, the police have now said that the situation is under control and that there's no further danger to the public.
Have we heard anything from the national government of Austria so far?
I mean, obviously, there's been, I was as shocked as anybody else here when I learned of this. And obviously, there's this, and I'm speaking to you from Vienna, but even at this distance, the shock is palpable, and this you can see this feeling, this sense of shock in across the country, and it coming from politicians and from the government as well. So the Chancellor, Christian Stocker, has just come out with a statement saying that this mass shooting is a national tragedy. There's been similar reactions from politicians right across the political spectrum. But again, there's this advisory from the police not to speculate on the motive of the suspected gunman. But obviously this sense of shock is here because this sort of incident is very, very rare in Austria. I mean, there's been obviously major terror attacks and shootings in the past, but school shootings especially are incredibly rare. And this will maybe lead to sort of a rethink of security measures in schools and educational institutions. I mean, there's been a sort of tightening of security measures in the wake of a foiled terror attack on a Taylor Swift concert in Vienna last summer. The US superstar, she cancelled those concerts when it emerged, when the police said that there was a plan to attack the venue where she was due to perform. And following that, there's been sort of a tightening of security measures and surveillance, including surveillance of messaging apps. So there is this understanding that the danger of such attacks, the threat of such attacks is there. But as I say, these incidents are quite rare in Austria.
Just finally, Alexei, I want to pick up on that thing you were saying about how police, local and national authorities have gone out of their way to warn people not to indulge in speculation, especially not on social media, about the identity or the motives of the perpetrator, because this has become a thing across Europe and across the Western world. When news emerges of anything of this nature occurring, there is this absolute frenzy of somewhat ghoulish speculation by people almost hoping that it will confirm their preferred political narrative.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and, in Austria, the far-right Freedom Party is very strong. It was very close to forming a government earlier this year and heading the Austrian government for the first time since the Second World War. And obviously their message is very much, over the past many years, has been very, very, racist and sort of very, on the right, very far right. So they especially, of course, would see this or would try to interpret this in their preferred manner. But that is exactly what the authorities here don't want to see, because as we've seen in recent attacks, including in Britain, speculation of this kind can lead to even more confusion and even more hate. And that's absolutely not what the authorities here in Austria, or indeed anywhere in Europe, want.
Alexei Korolyov, Monocle's Vienna correspondent, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Here is Tom Webb with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Russia has launched one of its largest airstrikes on Kyiv in over 3 years of war and struck the southern city of Odessa in attacks that killed at least 2 people. The overnight strikes followed Russia's biggest drone assault of the war on Ukraine in what Moscow says is retaliation for attacks by Ukrainian forces on Russia. Cuba has opened its first embassy in South Korea, marking a historic step after the two countries formally established diplomatic relations last year. The opening ceremony took place in Seoul and was attended by government officials of the two countries, as well as ambassadors of Latin American nations. A 1,500-year-old Byzantine tomb complex has been discovered by a construction worker in the war-torn province of Idlib in northern Syria. The discovery occurred in Marat al-Numan, a town that served as a former rebel stronghold during Bashar al-Assad's reign. The latest discovery adds to an already rich collection of archaeological sites in the area. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Tom. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. US President Donald Trump appears determined to further raise the stakes in his confrontation with, in escalating order of magnitude, protesters in Los Angeles, California Governor Gavin Newsom, Trump's enemies in general, real and imaginary. The president has ordered the deployment of still further National Guardsmen to Los Angeles, along with a battalion of the US Marine Corps. Well, I'm joined with more in the studio by Chris Lord, Monocle's executive editor. Chris, this is not the first time in American history that the National Guard or federal troops have been sent to some sort of civil disturbance, but how unusual is it?
Well, what differs from when this normally happens, if you like, is that usually it comes with the blessing and the request of the governor of that state. So probably the most recent example we can think of would be in the case of the 1992 Los Angeles riots, when you had a Republican governor, George H.W. Bush was in the White House at that time. He made a formal request and said, things are out of control. I need the military to step in. I need the National Guard to come and restore order on the streets. What Donald Trump has done here is he's sort of made the federal decision above the head of Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor of California, and deployed them essentially against his will, against the will of the governor. The last time that you can kind of point to was Lyndon B. Johnson, when he sent National Guard above the heads of Alabama's then governor to Selma to essentially stop protesters and counter-protesters in civil rights movement from killing each other. This is very different. This is to put down a protest. It is an extraordinary act of overreach and one that has ratcheted up tensions between the White House and America's most productive state in extraordinary terms.
Because as far as we're able to tell, does the scale of these protests even begin to appear to justify this level of intervention? Because the thing to bear in mind with protests is that it's very easy to take a spectacular or even alarming picture of a protest. You just need one person wrapped in a mask standing on top of a blazing taxi and you have your image. But of course, what that photo does not convey, that in the vast city of Los Angeles, in almost all of it, life is just proceeding in a normal and orderly fashion.
I suspect you've probably seen exactly what I have, Andrew, which is exactly that, which is a masked chap waving the Mexican flag on a car, which looks like a scene of absolute disorder. There seems to be smoke in the background. But then you pull back and you see that there's a ring of reporters stood around this guy. And then in the distance, a lot of sort of bemused onlookers who are watching. So there has been an extraordinary amount of misinformation, frankly, about the scale of these protests, how many people have descended on the streets since the weekend. There have been, look, when we came into work on Monday morning, the 101, which is the big spine of highway that runs through the centre of Los Angeles from north to south, from east to west rather, was closed by protested, a big chunk of it. Now, that's disruptive to the city. But at the end of the day, when you listen to what the LAPD is saying, there have been, roughly about 1,000 protesters at any one time. And also, within that, a very small proportion of whom are turning this into a sort of looting and rioting free-for-all. The majority are peaceful protests. Now, to send 2,000 troops in the National Guard on top of another 2,000 that were already there, and then call in the Marines with the threat of sending in another 700 Marines on top of that as well, anyone can see this is wildly disproportionate. Who knows what they're going to get up to today on the streets of Los Angeles, because there's not going to be, frankly, anywhere near enough protesters for them to put down.
Well, Governor Gavin Newsom has already said that of the National Guard deployed, only 300 of them have actually been found anything to do. But on the subject of Gavin Newsom, how much does he appear to be enjoying himself right now? He cannot, of course, run for governor again. He is term limited. Is he possibly already thinking that within the last few months we've seen President Trump help get two centre-left governments re-elected in Australia and Canada? Is Trump inadvertently working as a presidential election agent for the governor of California?
So the whole 3 years that I was in Los Angeles, the question of whether Gavin would run for the top job was obviously one that was very, very prominent. And let's not forget, he once famously started campaigning in Florida, the state literally on the other side of the country, with the idea that he could sort of square off to Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and present a different face of America. Look, that's what he's trying to do here. He enjoys, I think, the fact that Trump can play so well into his counter narrative with this, and the Democratic machine will be watching this very closely. Gavin has had a lot of opportunity to run for the top job, has not done that yet. He is ambitious. The Democrats desperately need a reboot of what they're for, frankly. And if what they're for is to stand up to, as Gavin Newsom is framing this, authoritarianism from the White House, which, it's very hard to challenge that idea that this is an authoritarian move. It is. It's overreach in the most stark terms. I think there is just a little bit just a slight reality check here, though, is that California, yes, didn't vote for Donald Trump in the most recent election, but the rest of America, much of the rest of America did. And frankly, there is a view in much of America that what California does and the way it manages its affairs are out of step with the way Americans want to live. And the way that this ICE rounding up and deportations and the agents that are out there to essentially find illegal immigrants and get them out of the country, the way that's being done, yes, a lot of people would not like the means that would be done. But at the same time, I can tell you, having reported from all over America, a lot of people view California's sanctuary status as a problem that affects the whole country. And so Gavin Newsom's going to have to play a bit of a careful game here, because he's going to need to, if he really does want to go for the top job and make a state for president, he can't run as the California president, frankly, given the state of California right now. And I think there is a real question, and a lot of Americans will be looking at what's happening in Los Angeles and saying, yes, what Trump is doing is disproportionate, but at the same time, is the messaging from the top people essentially saying ICE agents get out? Is that also what we want to hear? And I think the Democrats are going to have to take a bit of a reality check that the American view on immigration has changed quite profoundly.
Chris Lord, Monocle's executive editor, thank you for joining us. This is The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Efforts are ongoing to stiff-arm Iran into agreeing some sort of new binding deal over the future of its nuclear program. UN sanctions against Iran could be reimposed in October if a vote this week at the International Atomic Energy Agency goes against them. In the meantime, Iran claims to have obtained a stash of intelligence pertaining to Israel's officially undeclared but generally assumed arsenal of nuclear weapons, though responses to that boast are presently tending towards the sceptical. Well, I'm joined with more on this by Holly Dagres, Senior Fellow with the Washington Institute. Holly, do we know what the Iranians claim that they have on Israel?
Thanks for having me on the show, Andrew. I think it's really funny that news just broke that they said that their operatives had allegedly successfully completed their covert operation to obtain this large cache of what they call highly classified documents from Israel. And so if you think about it, this is basically a copy-paste of what the Israelis did to the Iranians just years ago. So it's almost like they're mimicking this intentionally, and whether this information is true or not, I guess we'll learn soon.
But is there anything or any information they could possibly have about Israel's nuclear program which would really startle anybody at this point? I mean, for all that Israel's nuclear weapons are officially undeclared, everybody knows they have them.
Absolutely. I think that our understanding is that there's some locations of nuclear facilities that they may be revealing if that were to be the case. And it's more of just a signaling from Tehran to Israel that, hey, if you decide to attack our nuclear facilities, we know where yours are and we'll attack them in return.
Does this seem like, I guess, a bit of a displacement exercise by Iran? Are they trying to avoid discussing what they're actually supposed to be discussing?
In some ways, yes, but I think this is part of a broader trend that we're seeing the Iranians do, which is not just emulate what Israel does, but actually emulate what President Donald Trump does. I recently wrote in a piece for the Washington Institute about how Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has been copying Trump's Twitter language or Twitter diplomacy, everything down to the all caps and the emphasis on business deals and avoiding forever wars. So I think there's definitely a messaging strategy there that they're trying to not just distract, but also deflect from the situation at hand.
I mean, it is all possibly the kind of theatre that goes on before and during negotiations, but do we yet understand where Iran is going with this or what Iran would agree to? As we have discussed on our programs over the last few weeks, Iran is not negotiating from the position of strength it may have believed it held last time a nuclear deal was negotiated.
Absolutely. Iran's in a dire situation, not just in terms of its regional dynamics post-October 7th, with much of its proxies being maimed in the region, but also domestically. They're struggling with a dire economic crisis that's been mostly at the hands of mismanagement, systemic mismanagement and corruption. And so they really need to put a Band-Aid on the economic situation, or else they're going to have another point of unrest, because Iranians on the ground are fed up with the situation, whether it's the repression or the economy. And so I think for them, this is a matter of regime preservation at this point. But in terms of what the Iranians are intending to do, well, they are not just masterful negotiators, they're also masterful time wasters. And I think that the Trump administration, President Trump has actually publicly talked about that just in the past few days, that he doesn't like that they're wasting his time. And so I think that there's really a time crunch between this snapback sanctions mechanism, which you just mentioned, that might happen in October, that is said to actually be taking place over the summer, especially with this Board of Governors meeting, helping deciding its fate in the coming days, but also because there's an actual deadline that the president has issued, that if these talks fall apart, it could lead to an actual escalation.
And Holly, just finally, and picking up on that question of regime preservation, as you put it, and this is possibly a somewhat bleak analysis of Iran's strategy here, but are we sure that the mullahs who run Iran, deep down where they live, actually want sanctions relief? Because it's not difficult to imagine that a more prosperous, more open, more engaged Iran could be pretty bad news for them in the long run.
Well, I think you make a very solid point. There's actually two elements to that argument. One is that the IRGC has benefited from the black market sanctions. So they've actually created this nouveau riche, and they're living their best lives under these sanctions. So it actually hurts their pockets if these sanctions relief were to happen. But separately, as you mentioned, there's different factions within Iran, and arguably what we call the so-called hardliners or principalists actually are opposed to Western engagement for that very reason, that they believe if Iran was to be open to the West for business, then there would be some kind of, foreign hand that would be playing with regime change in the country. And so they're really opposed to that notion as well. So there's definitely a lot of debate domestically on this very issue. It's not that everyone's for a deal, actually. And when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, those very hardliners in Tehran in parliament set fire to a paper version that they had printed out and chanted death to America. So I think that should give you a sense of where the mindset of some are in Iran right now.
Holly Dagras, Senior Fellow with the Washington Institute, thanks as always for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. What if they gave a referendum and nobody cared? This is the situation currently bemusing Italy, where a vote on easing restrictions on citizenship for immigrants has been lost, along with 4 other measures, because turnout fell a long way short of the 50% required to render any result valid. Italy's current government did its level best to stir up apathy throughout the campaign. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni did make a grudging token appearance at a polling station, but also made an ostentatious point of declining to cast a vote. Well, I'm joined with more on this by Monocle Radio's producer of the Foreign Desk, Anita Riota. Anita, had this initiative passed, what difference would it have made?
So on the citizenship question, it would have halved the period of residence required for all non-EU foreigners in the country from 10 years of residence to 5 years of residence before they can apply for Italian citizenship. As you mentioned, it needed 50% of the electorate to vote in order for whatever the result was to be legally binding. Unfortunately, only 30% of the electorate cast ballots, so obviously far short of that. Of those that did turn out to the ballots, more than 65% of voters supported the initiative, 35% opposed. And if it had passed, this initiative would have affected about 2.5 million foreign nationals in the country, many of whom have already been there for 5 years, so could have immediately applied for citizenship. And, you know, it's a big part of the community. Today, about 11% of all children attending Italian schools are foreign nationals.
I mean, there does appear a bit of a cognitive disconnect here. On the one hand, that the question of immigration and citizenship is a huge issue in Italy, as it is in many other places. But should we infer from the turnout that 65% of Italians don't really care about any of this one way or the other?
Well, low voter turnout has been a really big issue in Italy for a long time. Meloni herself was elected with a record low voter turnout. So I have to say, as a citizen of Italy and just generally pro-democracy gal, it is disappointing to see that the government took such a strong line of don't go out and vote the way that I think you should vote. Just don't vote at all. I think stirring up political disaffection in Italy is the exact force of apathy we should be fighting instead of leaning into.
And what have been the responses since this vote was lost, albeit lost on turnout, if not necessarily on result? The governing coalition, composed principally of the Brothers of Italy, the League, are very nationalist, nativist kind of parties. Have they been gloating untowardly?
Untowardly is for our listeners to decide, but gloating, I think, could be objectively agreed to. The League and Forza Italia both took to their social medias over the weekend to claim that Italians had preferred spending a sunny day on the beach rather than wasting their time at polling stations. And again, I mean, how does it make the citizenry feel that the government is taunting the opposition by being proud of the facts that people couldn't be bothered to show up and instead, went about their Sundays and Mondays as usual?
So just finally, where does this argument go now? Clearly, this is not a change that is going to be made by means of referendum. For the pro-immigration, smaller liberal parties that brought this initiative, what options do they have?
Well, it's tough to say. It's hopefully, at least for me personally, it's not an initiative that sort of fizzles out here. But historically, referendums in Italy are very difficult to win. Again, largely because of this history and current momentum of low voter turnout. But it's an issue that is becoming harder to ignore. As I said earlier, there are 2.5 million people who could be affected by this. There's 11% of all children in school who are foreign nationals. It's harder to continue to ignore the question of why are we not allowing these children to enter then, obviously when they're of working age, enter the workforce, become contributors to our economy, our culture, a country that is suffering from significant brain drain, an aging population, stagnating innovation. Why would you not embrace and encourage these children to then contribute to the national identity and the national economy? This became an issue last summer, or it sort of was brought back to the forefront last summer when the Italian national volleyball team, the women's national team, was led to their first Olympic gold medal by the Italian-born child of Nigerian parents who was born in Italy. Her first language, her name is Paola Egonu. Her first language is Italian, and she's really struggled to get citizenship. And so I think as the Italian social fabric starts to incorporate these people, whether the government would like them to or not, how do you sort of keep avoiding the issue?
Anita Riota, producer of Monocle's The Foreign Desk, thank you for joining us. There will be much more on this story in this week's edition of The Foreign Desk Explainer, which will be available later on tomorrow. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Since China introduced export restrictions on the critical minerals called rare earths back in April, impacts have spread across the global automotive industry. The issue was a key topic of last week's phone call between US President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart, President Xi Jinping. Interestingly, despite the export restrictions, China's rare earths exports in May increased 23% from the previous month, reaching an annual high. Well, I'm joined with more on this apparent conundrum by Yoye Olsen, a Swedish journalist and author based in Taiwan. What is the current situation with China's rare earths exports? How is it possible that they have restricted yet expanded them?
Yeah, the figure that you referred to, it's a month-on-month increase, and the export licenses that China has imposed on the rare earth metals, they started 2 months ago. But if you compare to last year, the amount of export is still much lower. And that's because China is now using the rare earth metals as a very efficient weapon in its trade war with the US and also in its ongoing negotiations with the EU. And it can do so because China is controlling over 60% of the mining of all the rare earth metals, but even more importantly, over 90% of all the refining into the rare earth magnets that are needed for all the high-tech production in the world, everything from cars to fighter jets and weapon systems. So a very efficient weapon to use in those trade negotiations.
I mean, the absence of rare earths or the restrictions on rare earths, as you suggest, have been felt particularly in the automotive sector overseas. Can you give us a specific example of how a dwindling supply of rare earths affects automobile manufacture?
Yeah, so automobile manufacturers, there are 2 rare earths that they need for the production of a car. And it looks like, especially in Europe, the inventories are pretty low here. So we heard the president of the European Trade Chamber in China in the end of May saying that many companies will run out of rare earth metals within a week. And this week, we heard German branch organizations saying that there is a full panic in the automotive sector. So we have a small component that is absolutely necessary for the production of cars. And the companies in Europe and also in the US, they have very low inventories of this. And it can only be imported from China. So there you have the equation.
I mean, rare earths, of course, have been a source of President Trump's apparent interest or conditional apparent interest in Ukraine. Is that part of, or could that be part of a process whereby the United States and Europe could conduct a system which does not rely on China for these materials?
There's no doubt plans and wishes from both the US and the European Union and other democracies that we don't have to rely on China for those rare earth magnets. But they are, in many ways, just wishes, because most analysts will say that it will at least take a decade, 10 years to establish supply chains in rare earth magnets that excludes China. And that is because in Europe, but also in the US, we have environmental concerns, we have regulations that doesn't exist in China, but also China has an almost total control on the pricing. So China can, price out other investments in the world by lowering its prices, much like China did on graphite. So that would make investments outside of China less profitable. So there is a need of a big state support to get those industries running in the West. And there is also reluctance to put that money on those investments.
Jörg Olsen, a Swedish journalist and author based in Taiwan. Thank you for joining us. That is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson and Ryuma Takahashi. Our researcher was Francesca Jokes and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing returns tomorrow at the same time, midday London. I'm Andrew Muller. Thanks for listening.